Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. I thought we'd spend a little time in the north of Africa today and talk a little bit about Libya. Quite a bit of different stuff is going on there. We've got the Ottoman Empire involved, along with the UN. What's the situation in Libya right now, Jim?
Well, basically, my last update was recently, and the war for Tripoli is still going on. That's the last stronghold of the UN GNA government, which never really worked. The basic problem is that the UN and many Western countries have classified Haftar as an incipient Gaddafi. Now, Haftar is an interesting guy. He used to be an officer in the Libyan army. Anyway, he got into a dispute with Gaddafi, and Haftar, basically got out before, Gaddafi could, have him silenced forever. He basically worked for the CIA for a while. He spent 20 years. He's an American citizen. Well, anyway, I pointed out that, any accusations that he wants to be another Gaddafi are kind of weird because he's 75 years old, and he's never indicated any interest in running the country. He's official and day-to-day job is the head of the Libyan National Army, which he basically put together 5 years ago when he returned, and realized that the country was basically coming apart with all these militias and what have you, and he was really upset about the Islamic militias and Islamic terrorist militias. I mean, there's basically a lot of religion-based militias, but most of them are basically thugs. The ones that are local tend to be, self-defense who basically turn into thugs, semi-thugs. You know how it goes. So Gaddafi, basically, he's from eastern Libya, Benghazi. He started there, and he was effective. I mean, he was methodical. He had a military background. He basically took care of his troops. And bit by bit, he suppressed first the Islamic terrorists, and then he started working on all the various independent militias. Some of them are tribal, some of them are local. There's a lot of them down in the southern border area, Niger and Chad and what have you, Sudan, which are basically arguing over who should control the smuggling operations down there. And he was mainly just interested in returning, law and order, which is what he's done. That's why he's been so popular. The Berbers support him. The Berbers are a big chunk of the population, and there's a lot of them south of Tripoli, which is why he's been so strong in that area. That's why he came up from the south, because he's got a base of support down there. The Berbers just want what the Kurds want. They want a little, autonomy. They don't want a separate country, but they just basically want a little respect, which Gaddafi never gave him. Gaddafi's main tool for running the country was basically working one group off against another. So if he saw one group was too strong and there was another one was willing to make a deal, he put them in charge, back them with the military, and basically create a long-term feud, because the guys that were on the losing end had to basically, suck it up for, as long as Gaddafi was in control, which was several decades. And once he was free, people were looking for revenge. They were looking for their piece of the action. Corruption is off the scale. They're one of the most corrupt countries in the world. The UN basically looked for somebody who was willing to go through the motions of setting up a democratic government. They'd already had elections. They elected the House of Representatives, as it's called. But then the UN came in and said, "All right, you're not basically to our taste, so we're going to set up a new one." They basically backed some local politicians, and they set up the GNA, but the GNA never took. And the House of Representatives government, the last elected government, they basically moved off to Tobruk, where they are now basically ruling most of the country through the Libyan National Army, which is technically subordinate to the House of Representatives. Basically, that's technical because Hiftar basically runs his own foreign policy. He doesn't interfere with government administration as long as it's reasonably, honest, and doesn't basically upset the apple cart. So, like I say, it's popularity. He's been popular. He comes into an area, he basically suppresses the banditry, the uber thuggish militias and what have you. He will co-opt them. He will basically say, "You can join me or fight me," and most of them decide to join. He sends in officers. He basically recruits people for the regular army units, but a lot of his troops are basically militias, which are reasonably loyal. But most of those militias are basically local, and he leaves them local. He says, "Look, you take care of your area. I'll send in support if needed," and he's been doing that. But he finally, and that's why he didn't go after Tobruk. I mean, the GNA thought, well, he's going to immediately make a run for the capital. But no, he's a professional military guy. He's more concerned with logistics and long-term planning. Well, he finally got, he controls all the oil facilities. He controls the oil export points. He basically cooperates with the GNA, through the UN, they control the Libyan National Bank, or at least most of it, and the National Oil Company, which basically works for Hiftar, but they're basically a creature of the UN and the GNA. So it's a complicated situation there. And Hiftar, when he started to go after Tripoli, it was believed that he'd be able to get in there pretty quick because the militias were fighting each other when they weren't, fighting, uniting to fight someone else, which is rare. And so he thought he'd take advantage of that. And lo and behold, who should come to the rescue of the militias defending the Tripoli and the GNA but Turkey, sort of out of nowhere. Actually, the Turks have been accused of running guns to the militias in the past, because the Turks support militias that are Islamic, Islamic Brotherhood Islamic. In other words, not Islamic terrorists. Turks, as far as we can tell, never supported ISIL, Islamic State, in Libya. Islamic State was finally put down with American air support, heavy air support, 2 years ago in Sitri, which they tried to set up as a capital. Hiftar hadn't reached Sitri yet, so he said, "All right, you guys want to do it? Go ahead, knock yourselves out." And while they spent almost a year taking down Sitri, and then Hiftar basically has been fighting ISIL remnants in the south ever since. He's been basically handling them, and so as a result of all that, Libya is no longer a friendly place for ISIL, which is good, despite whoever did it. But the Tripoli problem is a difficult situation, because as long as Tripoli and the GNA hold out, there's no united Libya. And plus the fact that the GNA controls technically the major financial institutions. Hiftar has set up a independent branch of the National Bank in Benghazi. He controls the oil, but he can't legally profit from the exports unless he works through the UN controlled or UN recognized, national oil company and bank. So he's obviously shown his willingness to cooperate, but the last stumbling block is the return of the Turks, who were tossed out over a century ago. The Italians did that, I believe. But the basic problem is, let's get down to the nuts and bolts. Libya has never been a country. It's one of those, not many, but there's several of them. Somalia, Afghanistan. Most of the real trouble spots are areas that never really coalesced as a nation state in the past. The colonial government did it. The Turks sort of did it, but the Turks basically ruled Libya as two separate provinces, the Benghazi province and the Tripoli province. And they paid no attention to what was going on in the interior, because until the oil was discovered after World War II, there was no there. There were a few people, and there was certainly no money. The oil basically financed a monarchy, which the Italians after World War II, that was set up and left behind. That didn't last long. Gaddafi was an army officer. He staged a coup, and he basically stayed in power, for over 40 years. Not obviously ruling well because there was constant, uprisings on, people who were trying to turn against him, like Hiftar. But he basically had control until Arab Spring came along. Neighboring Tunisia was where the Arab Spring started. It's the one uprising that was successful. They're still holding elections and running their government despite all the Islamic terrorists they've had to deal with. And Hiftar has the backing of not the Turks, obviously, but the United Arab Republics and Egypt. Now, Egypt supports Hiftar mainly because Hiftar shut down the border. In other words, he basically stopped the border from being a free, Islamic terrorist-free operating zone. They were running guns into Egypt. They were running terrorists back and forth. He basically established a border guard, and he basically closed the border. So the Egyptians are into him for that. But it's the UAEs that's supporting the air support, Chinese, Predator equivalents with missiles. The Turks came in with their own homemade UAVs, which are not as effective as the Chinese ones, but they've been using them extensively. They've taken heavy losses. They keep shipping in additional ones. The UN sort of ignores all these weapon shipments from the Turks. But what the Turks moved in that was most useful was the military advisors, because the GNA had no, how should I put it, military expertise. They had all these militias which basically did what you wanted when they felt like it, which wasn't very often. They were involved in the smuggling, especially people smuggling, and whatever else they could do to earn a buck. The Turks are in a difficult situation because they are helping a UN-approved government. So the UN is sort of, how should I put it, handling this with, kid gloves. I mean, they're not cracking down on the Turks. And even now with the fighting in Tripoli, which by Arab standards is pretty, sedate. Hiftar has been methodically advancing. When the Turks moved in and he started running up against resistance, as well as some obviously well-organized, counterattacks supervised by the Turks, by the militias, he realized that, all right, I'm not near peer at this point. I'm not fighting another army, but I'm fighting one that has the help of another army. I mean, he would respect the Turks in that respect, but he's not giving up. And therein lies the rub. Most Libyans back Hiftar. In other words, if they had their druthers, they'd rather have Hiftar than whatever the UN has conjured up. Their sort of Frankenstein monster of a national government, which isn't viable and is being kept alive on health support, which was going to disappear until the Turks showed up. So at the moment, in my last couple of updates, I reported that the offensive, which started in April, made great strides initially. Hiftar's shut down both the airports around. There's no international airport around Tripoli. You got to go by ground to Misrata, which is another nest, as it were, of militias. But Misrata is smaller. If Tripoli falls, Misrata is not going to be that big of a problem. It will be a problem, but I mean, it won't be as much of a hassle as Tripoli. So the problem here is the Turks. Hiftar is still basically grinding along. The Turks haven't been able to stop him. They've been able to slow him down. But this is just going to grind on. He's not losing a lot of troops, which is how he keeps his army together. The Amnesty International and the various other, how should I put it, groups that accuse anybody who kills anybody as a war criminal, are making a lot of noise. But, Libya has always been a low casualty war. It's not been a bloodbath like Syria. There's not as many people as there are in Syria. There's no Assads. Russians ironically backed Hiftar, but they send him equipment and some advisors. But it's a sort of a arm's length. They just want to earn the goodwill of Hiftar because they feel he's going to end up on top, and whoever succeeds him, the House of Representatives government will be looking for somebody they can work with to help rebuild. Libya has the money, Russia needs the work. You know how that works. There's no Chinese involvement. It's basically just Russia, the Arabs, versus the UN and the Turks. It's an odd place. It's an odd situation, but it's slowly coming to an end.
Austin?
Well, Jim's given you a detailed rundown on what's been going on in Libya since 2011 and who the pizza pie of players. The GNA, Dan, is an absolute mess. And that's as Jim described, the UN-backed government and the government that you said the return of the Ottoman Empire. It's the Erdogan Empire. I mean, Erdogan is the. I just thought of that, but that's really what it is. I'll speak to the return Turkey's involvement with it. LNA. Jim kicked off his discussion by saying that Hiftar is an interesting character. Well, he is. The rumor has it that he's a CIA operative. He doesn't behave much like a CIA operative. He was a CIA asset because he was an anti-Gaddafi Libyan army officer who fled and then ultimately was in exile in the United States. And given Gaddafi's troublemaking in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, even after the end of the Cold War, when having Russian backing wasn't a ace card, we paid attention to any senior diplomat or military officer who rebelled against Gaddafi, and Haftar just had to have more on the ball than most. Also, seemed to be more competent than most. Now, I'm going to make a couple of geographic comments here. Jim mentioned that the GNA holds Tripoli, also, and Misrata. Last I read, they also had some militias loyal to them in Sirte, which is
yes.
where ISIL. I think I'm right on that. But
no, you're right. But Sirte is still basically controlled by conflicting, militias that are fighting each other.
And one of the other things, Jim had this in a recent Libya update that he did too. Remember AFRICOM? That's us.
Yeah,
we're still active in there, even though we're not doing manned aircraft airstrikes. We're still looking to pick off ISIL/ISIS remnants that fled Sirte, and who knows where they went. They probably went south to try to find an oasis. Good luck to them fleeing south. They're going to run into either desert, and if they get and Berbers who don't like them at all. That's there's the ethnic component there, as well as the Berber disgust with radical Arab Muslim terrorists. They'll either round them up or they'll never be heard from again, or more likely the Berbers give AFRICOM targeting advice when they see one of these guys move through. So that's another war that's in this mix of wars that Jim described. Sirte's an interesting town. That is where Gaddafi was from. And the GNA, one of the things that the House of Representatives over in Tobruk says in their press releases, their propaganda, is that GNA is still tied to Gaddafi. That's quite a stretch, but there's enough emotional appeal to it that it adds to the fact that the House of Representatives really was elected. Whether the election was clean by our standards, it was it was the best election, one of the two best elections Libya had since Gaddafi took power over, I think it was King Idris was the fellow he toppled. So you've got the situation where the East, Cyrenaica, Benghazi, has taken over Tripolitania with the exception of the capital, Tripoli, and Turkey intervenes to stop this offensive that Haftar and the Libyan National Army, as Jim said, it began in April. It was quite effective. It was coordinated. It looked to me, and I said look to me, I mean, I'm relying on open source material just like Jim is, but also military and his common sense and historical understanding of the situation, that it was coordinated with LNA's supporters to the point that you were getting an intelligence on where GNA forces were. United States, France, who knows, and he also was very effective, as Jim said, in turning some of these independent militias, knock off their bandits and say, okay, you're a local defense force, and if some of you're better soldiers, I'll recruit you. Otherwise, stay put, and I'll support you. A very intelligent way for a revolutionary, because he is a revolutionary military commander, to conduct an offensive, to move. He didn't move all of his forces from the east. He already had forces in the west. But then again, coalesce, and you can see them. Really, they had two main axes of advance on Tripoli before Turkey intervenes. Now, Jim said Turkey ruled Libya. They would call it Tripolitania, as using the West, but it really was. It was actually they had several sub districts within it, but it was primarily they were using a Roman map. Cyrenaica, Cyrene, if Simon of Cyrene in the New Testament carries Christ's cross, was a Greek from that city in the east, and Tripolitania, three cities, that was the Western Roman province. There was another administrative area, and this is carried on somewhat in contemporary Libya. It's down in the south and southwest, and the name of it is escaping me now. I think it starts with an F, but think of it as Berber territory, and you're right. When the revolt against Gaddafi took place, French special forces moved into there with the Berbers. Remember, the French are operating with Berber kin in the West, fighting Islamic extremists, and in some cases, some of the Tuareg who are Berber people as well, who are in rebellion against the Mali government. Aside here, I think we discussed this at one. The Berbers have some legitimate disagreements with that Mali government. But French special forces came in 2011 and started supplying was essentially a Berber insurgency in southwestern Libya. As Jim said, this was a country that never cohered. And part of it is that he said there was no there in the south till oil was discovered. Really, the only there is along that coastline, which is where when the Muslim Arab invasion followed right along the coast, picking up all the cities: Tobruk, Benghazi, Sirte, Misrata, and finally Tripoli. That's what you could control if you had a navy. And Italy in 1911 has eyes on it becoming a colonial power. The Ottoman Empire is rotten, so in September, I think it was, of 1911, Italy attacks, and Italy can grab the coastal cities. It's got a modern navy, and the Ottoman Empire has no navy. But very few cases could the Turks move more than 20 kilometers outside of the ports and outside of the ports along the Mediterranean, because when they did, they ran into logistical problems and ran into Senussi tribesmen mounted on horses and camels, and also a very thin veneer of Turkish troops that many officers leading some of these Arab auxiliaries. They couldn't get out and get at the resistance, which is out in the desert. One reason Tripoli right now, gets back to the geographic point, has not been taken is that the Turks and the UN can supply those forces in Turkey. In Tripoli with sufficient weapons and food to sustain themselves. And Turkey's been supplying this. Jim wrote this up a couple of weeks ago in a Libya update. Some armed drones that I don't know who's operating them. Jim may know. It may be Turk operators. They're not that difficult for some of the Libyans in the GNA to operate. So they've got their own Air Force. There are a number of, as Jim in that update also went into a discussion of surface-to-air missiles. That both sides have the capability of putting up an air defense envelope, and around Tripoli, it would be fairly dense compared to, the defensive systems that the GNA had. So you're presenting the LNA with a tactical and operational problem. The strategic problem is something else, and Jim touched on that. The strategic problem is the LNA and the House of Representatives are far more popular, even in this disparate, I call it a pizza pie country. Part of it is that they see a Haftar and the House of Representatives as far more legitimate than this foreign entity, the GNA foreign entity, United Nations. Jim touched on the fact that Libyans across the board don't like Turks. Turks were their imperialists. Remember that. The Italians replaced them from 1912 to 1943. 1943, another army moved through, in that case, British Eighth Army chasing Rommel. But that was it. The Ottomans were something else. They controlled the area for only 2.5 centuries. So they're not liked. Erdogan, I don't know if it's gotten to the point that they see him as an inimical personality, but I think some of what he sees out of the GNA is supporting the GNA is, first of all, he gets to align himself with the UN, at least nominally. And second, Turkey gets to act on an independent policy axis, which is something that appeals to his sense of destiny, the importance of himself, and the importance of Turkey as an independent power. But if it seems confusing within Libya, he aligns himself against Russia and France, who support the Libyan National Army. I wrote a column several months ago where I said if you look at some of the other pieces in play with the Libyan National Army and House of Representatives, essentially the United States is a quasi-ally of the Libyan National Army. We claim that we haven't chosen sides, but again, if you look at what AFRICOM is doing vis-a-vis the ISIL, if you look at the some of the rhetorical, political, diplomatic support, and also the U.S. Support for I forget the term that I've seen used for this, but free shipment, protected shipment of oil out of the ports. That's something that's in everyone's interest. To the point, as Jim pointed out, there's this curious agreement between the LNA and GNA that there's supposed to be a sharing of oil revenue royalties. I'm not quite sure how that's administered. Jim, you may know, but I think the UN does have a finger in that. But there's also several other European countries and the United States had said that we support this as a path to peace and as a way to keep Libya afloat. Both Libyas somewhat afloat economically. Where does this go? I think Jim hinted at it. I see an LNA victory, but I've seen an LNA victory really for the last couple of years, given the fact of just the amount of ground they control and the fact that the several key cities, and again, the Berbers support what the House of Representatives and the Libyan National Army. At some point, there's going to be a negotiated end to it. I don't know that would lead to a complete end to the civil war, because there are going to be a number of GNA survivors that are, because of some of the crimes they committed, are not going to be welcomed, are allowed to stay alive in Libya. So I'm not going to put a time frame on that, but sometime I would say I'm about to do it anyway, next 12 to 18 months. Jim, what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, the Hiftar was actually sitting down and talking with Siraj, the head of the GNA government, and they were trying to work out a deal. But what basically made a deal difficult or impossible was the fact that too many of the militias in Tripoli did not want a Hiftar government, because they knew a Hiftar-dominated government would not tolerate what the militias were doing, which was basically running their own protection rackets and doing whatever the hell they wanted.
They're going to prosecute some of them and prosecute them with a gun barrel. I mean, there's some blood in the water with some of the crimes that those guys have committed. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that's the kind of thing that isn't going to be solved by negotiation. That's those guys are going to have.
Well, like I said, they tried, but the basic stumbling block was all the militias. They are basically the constituency of the GNA. And a lot of those militias, the Islamic ones, don't believe democracy is Islamic and is forbidden. That was a stumbling block from day one. And the rest of the country said, "Look, we'll give it a shot." But the Islamic militias, again, not Islamic terrorists so much, but just religious, they have basically said no. Now, what kind of government they want is probably something along a Muslim Brotherhood religious dictatorship, but that never works out. They tried it in Egypt. They've, it doesn't work. But basically, if you're playing the I'm more Islamic than thou game, there's no compromise. And that's what Siraj has been up against. And the UN refuses to basically confront that. They basically just don't want to have their pet project, fail, because they tried several other times to get things going, government going in Libya, and it constantly failed. And nobody, for whatever reason, nobody wants to admit that it's the independent militias. It's not just in Tripoli, but also in Misrata, to a lesser extent in Sirte, in the coastal cities where most of the people and money are, that are the difficulty. And until you basically put them down by negotiation or force, you're not going to have a united Libya, and you're not going to have peace. And people just don't like to. The UN in particular doesn't want to confront that. The UAE and the Egyptians, most Arab countries, recognize that. They say, look, this is North Africa. This the Maghreb. This is Arabia, so to speak. And that's the way things work. But the UN, they have a different playbook that doesn't, how should I put it, doesn't allow for that sort of, talk. So there we are. The UN was willing to follow Siraj if he made a deal with Hiftar. But again, it was the militias. So it's always the militias. Hiftar is the only force in Libya that can basically neutralize militias, and that's the last thing the militias in the two major cities still under GNA control, Misrata and Tripoli. And Tripoli is by far the larger cities. All other cities along the coast are relatively small, except for Benghazi. And Benghazi has long been, the base for Hiftar. In fact, Hiftar made his reputation in Benghazi. That place was basically just, littered with various Islamic terrorist groups as well as Islamic militias. And Hiftar got the cooperation of some of the local tribes who were willing to try anything as long as it basically suppressed the independence of the Islamic terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda related, and also Islamic State after 2014. It works for them. I mean, they're going along with it. You'll always have a problem of tribalism. The tribes in the South are particularly, touchy about their independence, as it were. But, Hiftar's Libyan. He knows how that works. You make deals. But the problem is that the Islamic militias in Misrata and Tripoli are not willing to make a deal unless it's an Islamic deal, and that's a no starter for the rest of Libya. So there's the conflict. There's where the how should I put it, the irresolvable conflicts are, and I think Hiftar believes if he can get into Tripoli and basically control the center of the city and then spread out. I mean, he's done this before. They did in Benghazi. One by one, he can suppress the militias because they will not cooperate that much with each other. It all comes down to they control this neighborhood, they control that neighborhood, and I think the militias realize that. The Turks came in and they advised them, said, look, if you do this and you do that, you'll be a little more successful. And that's improved their defense somewhat, but not enough, because basically Hiftar has more support, among Libyans, and he's got the numbers. He's also got everything else. The UN might suddenly flip, which would be embarrassing because they're very diplomatic, as it were, and they don't want to flip. They have to admit they made a lot of mistakes, but they've been making mistakes all along in Libya, and that's the problem. So everybody's got to basically put aside their pride, as it were, and do something for the good of Libya. And turning over Libya to a bunch of militias is not doing anything for Libya, and that's why most Libyans, back, Hiftar. What comes after Hiftar, who knows? Because, like I say, Libya has never been a unified state, and as Austin points out, until quite recently, until the discovery of oil, there was no real interest in the interior. And the Europeans, as far as they're concerned, they want to stop the illegal migration. It goes back to what the North African city-states have been infamous for hundreds of years: piracy. And that's why France took Algeria out. And the Marine Corps mentions to the shores of Tripoli. It was all about pirates, and they finally suppressed the pirates in the 19th century. But now you have these basically this city-state mentality, and you still have the religion problem with the Islamic political militias. So there you go. There's never been a Libya. There may never be a Libya. If there is any chance for a unified Libya, it's going to be under someone like the House of Representatives, with Hiftar doing the heavy lifting. But he's not going to last much longer. I mean, he's already had some health problems. That's why I say he's definitely not angling to be another Gaddafi. Gaddafi started when he was a young man. And Hiftar's never indicated that. And like I say, he lived in America for 20 years, and he's basically he knows how a democracy works. He's a well-educated man. He gets along with the Europeans. He gets along with the Russians, and he's willing to deal. But you can't deal with the religious fanatics, and that's the one thing he's absolutely against.
Let me add something else to that, Dan. Egypt, Tunisia, and Algeria are absolutely against any kind of religious government arising in Libya. I'm talking about an Islamic religious government, one that's militantly Islamic. Because Egypt had its experience with the Muslim Brotherhood dictatorship. Tunisia has emerging as the special case where their Muslim party, the Ennahda party, turns over power to a center liberal coalition, liberal in the British sense, and Algeria has had it completely with religious fanatics, and those are the quote-unquote Arab countries on either side of Libya. One other thing that, and Jim touched on this early on, the LNA and House of Representatives have lines of supply coming out of Egypt as well, and that includes, besides military, diplomatic, and political support from the al-Sisi government. So there's a ton of international diplomatic power on the side of the LNA. One thing that you know what I think about Erdogan and the Turks on this. The insertion, and this is me coming up with a scenario that I have no basis in fact on, but it's also when Jim said that the UN could flip on the GNA, Erdogan could flip on the GNA and come in and say, look, you see how Turkey gets along. We're a moderate Islamist government. This is what you need, the approach you need to take now, and make a deal with the LNA. And then he gets to portray himself as a big peacemaker. I just made that up, Dan. But that's one of a factor that could go in with a flip that also allows the UN to save some face. You look at all of the support elements, diplomatic, political, military, really economically as well, and the House of Representatives and LNA, Haftar have the power right now. I don't see it getting less. As Jim said, these militias that support the GNA, many of them hate one another, and a good example would be the biggest militia in Misrata. The biggest militia in Misrata is Islamic. It's not Islamic terrorists, it's Islamic. It was anti-Gaddafi. They put up a hell of a fight against Gaddafi that is recognized throughout the rest of Libya. Gaddafi's forces could never drive them out. They had to circle around Misrata when they launched their offensives into the east. Last thing I'll say, too, Jim mentioned that about all these little pirate cities. Sirte is interesting for a lot of reasons. It was a pirate city. I told you that's where Gaddafi was from. According to what I read when I was researching my biography on Kemal Ataturk and also the Turco-Italian War of 1911-1912, which is when Italy invaded, is that Sirte was one of the last places, where Old Punic, the Phoenician language, was actually spoken until 4th century AD. Now, I'm not sure all of the orthography and philologists that would come up with that, but it was operating as an independent city-state, and it had been a Phoenician city, and that would be what, Jim, about 6 centuries after Carthage fell.
Yes.
It's kind of a crazy place. You can't get into the future because you can't get out of the past. So.
Well, we'll end things there, and we'll watch what happens over the next few months, and we'll probably be talking about them again. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next time.
Take care, guys.
Bye.
Bye.